For centuries, Americans have considered their government a model for the rest of the world. But after the last few elections, a lot of Americans have lost faith in our system.
Where are those votes coming from? What's going on?
Fewer than half, 44%, have a great deal or quite a bit of confidence that the votes in the next presidential election will be counted accurately.
Something has been started in this country that now cannot be stopped.
How did this happen? On the one hand, our politicians keep claiming that our elections are rigged.
They rigged an election. They rigged it like they've never rigged an election before.
Trump, most famously, did it after 2020. But so did Democrat Stacey Abrams in Georgia, who claimed she won a race she lost.
We were robbed of an election.
After losing in 2016, Hillary Clinton claimed the election was stolen.
You can run the best campaign. You can even become the nominee. And you can have the election stolen from you.
Politicians contesting election results are now a fixture of American political culture. In 2004, some Democrats suggested Ohio was rigged for Bush.
Rarely has it ever been this close.
In 2000, the Supreme Court had to intervene in Bush versus Gore because of election issues in Florida. There is, of course, an obvious solution. Make our elections more secure so people won't doubt them. Give Americans a reason to have faith in the system. That's what decent leaders who cared about the country and its institutions would do. They'd make sure we confirm the identities of voters. They'd maintain accurate voter rolls. They'd deliver election results on election night. They'd make it easier to vote and harder to commit fraud. But sadly, it seems our leaders don't care. They've done just the opposite. We are in the critically important swing state of Michigan because this state has completely transformed its election laws since Trump won it by just 10,000 votes in 2016. It's also one of the closest polling swing states in the upcoming election, and one that will likely determine the outcome of the race. So what's changed? Why are they doing it? And how have other states changed their election systems in the past 5 years? That's what we're here to find out. I'm Sara Gonzales, and this is Blaze Originals. So we are on the way to talk to State Senator Ruth Johnson here in Michigan. She is someone who really knows what's going on here down on the ground, and she actually ran the Secretary of State office when Trump was elected back in 2016 by a very narrow margin. So let's go see what she has to say.
Hi.
Hi, Senator.
Hi.
Hi, so nice to meet you, Sara Gonzales.
Sarah, come on in.
So, Senator, tell me what has changed here.
There's only 5 states that are considered swing states, and Michigan is one of them. And many things have changed, which has lessened the security of our elections in the last few years.
Since Trump won the state in 2016, Michigan has completely overhauled its election system. In 2018, Michigan voters replaced Johnson, who was term limited, with Jocelyn Benson, a Harvard-educated law professor and former SPLC lawyer. She once received funding from George Soros' controversial Secretary of State project, which targeted low-profile Secretary of State races. Under her leadership and empowered by the pandemic, things changed in Michigan.
She sent unsolicited absentee voter ballot applications to over 800,000 people that weren't qualified to vote, and then she told the clerks, don't verify the signatures. She tried to allow ballots to be counted if they were received after Election Day, so I had to go in and sue her, and we won.
In an email, Benson's office tacitly acknowledged that Michigan's voter rolls are stacked with ineligible voters, saying they've, quote, identified more than 500,000 additional records slated for cancellations in 2025 and 2027, notably after this year's presidential election, adding, many of which were left languishing on the voter rolls under the previous secretary's administration. They added that the reason more than 350,000 registrations are slated for cancellation in 2025 is because of a statewide mailing the Secretary of State sent out in 2020, something the previous secretary failed to do in her entire 8 years in office. But even with inflated rolls, what's really transformed the state's elections were 2 statewide ballot referendums that amended the state's constitution, like Proposition 3 in 2018.
What it does is it allows for same-day registration The problem is we don't have real-time computers, so we don't know if they're really a qualified voter. So you can register without showing photo ID. Photo ID is like the foundation of everything. You have to have photo ID to get a fishing license in the state or even to take a book out of the library.
In 2022, a consortium of left-wing groups pushed another referendum, Proposal 2, which essentially gutted the state's election integrity measures.
And that prohibits the people that run our elections to even ask for photo ID. So now we can't even ask for it.
The referendum received nearly $24 million in funding from a laundry list of left-wing groups, which paid for ads like this one.
Prop 2 puts our voting rights directly in the state constitution,
including voter ID requirements.
So only eligible citizens can vote.
Vote yes on Prop 2.
Voters had to take their word for it. The actual text of Proposal 2 was nearly 2,500 words long, too long to actually print on the ballot.
You can only put less than 100 words on the actual ballot.
After the ballot initiatives, Michigan residents now have a constitutional right to vote by mail. To make matters worse, in April, Michigan's Senate passed a bill that would bar local officials from investigating fraud, illegal activity, or even ballot tampering during a recount. The last remaining safeguard is a Michigan law that requires local clerks to verify signatures on absentee ballots. In 2021, Secretary Benson attempted to change the process by making clerks presume the signatures are accurate. Her proposal was defeated by the courts.
Unfortunately, right now, my Democratic colleagues are making it even easier to cheat.
The list of issues is long. Bloated voter rolls, widespread mail-in voting, ballot drop boxes in a heavily unionized state with a highly organized left. It's a recipe for disaster in what will surely be one of the closest swing states in this year's presidential election. If I lived in Michigan and I moved to the state of Texas, would I still be registered to vote in the state of Michigan?
You would be.
And I vote in Texas. Do you in Michigan have a way to see whether or not I've already voted in Texas?
Another huge flaw in our system. There's no way for the Secretary of State or anyone else to know that you voted in 2 states. There's nothing systemically to tell us whether somebody has voted in more than 1 state. Actually, because you don't have to show ID anymore, we don't even know if you voted twice in Michigan or 3 times or 4. The system is full of holes. So we had a bill, the Republicans, that would allow free ID to everybody. We wanted to expand it and then require photo ID at the polls, and our governor, Gretchen Whitmer, she vetoed that bill.
That just seems so sinister to me.
We used to be a Republican state. Right now we have Democrats that have the House, the Senate, the AG's office, Secretary of State, and governor.
In the interest of balance, we wanted to get a sense of what the other side thought of Michigan's election reforms. Why did they support them? What's wrong with voter ID? We asked Governor Whitmer and Secretary Benson for interviews. They didn't respond, so then we tried the left-wing groups that supported their initiatives, like Promote the Vote and ACLU. We tried Democrats in the state legislature and local left-wing groups in Detroit. Everyone blew us off, so we decided our best option was to go to Detroit, which went 95% for Biden in 2020, and to get Detroiters' perspectives directly. All right, we are in downtown Detroit. We are asking people out here, do they support photo ID voter laws? Do you think that in the state of Michigan, people should have to show a photo ID in order to vote?
You should. If you don't have an ID, you can't even hang out with me.
Are you from Detroit?
I'm from Pontiac, Michigan. Yorktown, stand up.
Do you think that people should have a photo ID required in order to vote?
Of course, yes, most definitely. I feel like everybody need that ID. You can't without ID. I'm sorry. Can't do nothing without ID. Period.
Do you think that we should have to have a photo ID?
I think that's pretty a simple thing to ask. I mean, you should be able to prove who you are. You should be able to know who's voting.
What would you say to those who fight against that in the state of Michigan?
I'll say y'all forget all that. Y'all go get y'all life right, man. Y'all need your ID. You can't do nothing without identification.
The thing about voter ID laws is that they're very popular. According to Gallup, a full 79% of Americans support requiring a photo ID to vote, including most Democrats. It seems like a voter ID law would be a sensible way to prevent a repeat of the 2020 debacle, in which President Trump used weak election laws as a pretense for claiming the election was stolen.
They're trying to rig an election, and we can't let that happen. Detroit and Philadelphia, known as two of the most corrupt political places anywhere in our country.
We are on the way to go meet with Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Charlie LaDuff. He actually was on the ground counting votes in 2020 in downtown Detroit. He wanted to meet outside this hot dog restaurant over here. Let's go meet him. Hello. Hi. You're former New York Times.
And Fox.
And Fox.
And Discovery. And a best-selling author. And 2 Pulitzer Prizes.
Yes. So you were in downtown Detroit.
Right down there.
Okay. On election night.
Yes, it
Helping
was.
count votes.
Yes.
What did you see?
The reason I did it was so I could report back to you. Nothing happened. No 150,000 ballots came in at 4 in the morning. Didn't happen. I processed more absentee ballots in Michigan than anybody. And I was a reporter. And if the 150,000 bogus ballots came in, you don't think I'm gonna tell you that?
Right.
That's the easiest Pulitzer Prize in the world. It didn't happen. Is it a mess? You right, it's a mess. Do I, let me say, have concerns about how sloppy the election system is, especially with mail-in? Yes. And I can tell you all about it, and I will. But people have a right to be concerned, and they shouldn't be shut up, and they shouldn't be dismissed, and it should be cleaned. And it's not hard to do it.
Well, why do you think they're not doing it? I agree with you. It's not
I
hard.
don't know why.
No.
Could the election be stolen?
He's got his pinky up.
It could. I mean, you want to go deep, we can go deep here. This is the Auditor General, friend of mine, Doug Ringler. Here it is, 2022. The Office of the Auditor General looked at the election. It's a pretty decent one. You just look at this page here.
Board of Elections.
You're doing it for TV, go ahead.
Not perform a periodic reconciliation between the driver's license file and QVF. We identified discrepancies in addresses and death status that, if identified and corrected, could help decrease the risk of ineligible electors voting in Michigan.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Right, the Board of Elections did not perform a periodic reconciliation between the driver's license file. Secretary of State, here's the driver's license, here's your address, here's the qualified voter file, here's the voting roll. You're not checking if the address is the same.
Right. Yeah. Do you believe in any of the, the mail-in ballot boxes being stuffed with a bunch of...
I don't believe 150,000 people filled out 2 ballots. That didn't happen. The way you could do it is the clerk, the local clerk, would have a list of who moved away and never took them off the roll.
Right.
Remember, they're drop boxes. You don't even have to mail those out. You could have just filled them out and put them in your own drop box.
Right.
But that would be the physical way you could do it.
Yeah.
And there's a big problem here, and people believe this, and I don't consider them ridiculous or silly. I don't.
Right.
I think they're being wishful, overly so, but I understand the concern, and as a moderate, I would like it to be fixed. And they don't fix it. I mean, for sake, even the French use paper, and you gotta have an ID. I mean...
So, Secretary of State Benson, she won't talk to us.
Because he's a chick, she won't talk to me. Do you know you don't have to show any documentation whatsoever to register to vote?
None.
None, ever. So it goes like this. I'm a U.S. citizen. Yeah. Okay. Do you swear? I do. Good. What's your address? I live by the dumpster. Okay, good enough. That's the rules in Michigan. How moronic is this?
Well, but then it's like, is it moronic or is it intentional? Is it by design?
Well, I don't know. Secretary of State, duly elected, won't give you the time of day?
Right.
You're actually a really reasonable person. I'm sort of in the middle on this, and you're not badgering me. You're not calling me a fool. Why wouldn't she talk to you? Right. Fix it.
So you don't think either party really wants to fix the system?
I f***ing hate them because it's so obvious what needs to be done. Right? Everybody takes a cut.
I need a cigarette.
Okay.
Hey, what up, though? You good? It's spring. Did you vote?
Yeah.
How many times?
It was clear after a couple days in Michigan that the state has a lot of problems, but the biggest issue of all still needed to be addressed: the voter rolls. In March, the RNC filed suit against Michigan, alleging that the majority of Michigan counties, including the big ones around Detroit, had more registered voters than adults over the age of 18. Amazingly, it's not even the first time the state has been sued for inflated voter rolls, including people who have been dead for decades. We always hear about these dead voters voting in elections in, Chicago, Detroit, stuff like that. But I hear that you actually found some dead voters.
Yes, so we have a lawsuit that we filed in Michigan about deceased registrants on Michigan's voter rolls.
Lauren Biss is the communications director at the Public Interest Legal Foundation, an election integrity watchdog that sued Michigan over its voter rolls. They're currently appealing their case after it was dismissed by a Biden-appointed judge. She offered to take us to the tombstones of some Michigan voters. The polls right now for the 2024 election show, they're pretty close. They're neck and neck here in the state. Any sort of, funny business would be pretty significant, especially when you talk about, people accepting the results of the election. Benson's office called the suit baseless and referenced federal data cited in the judge's dismissal that shows Michigan is the 5th most active state in removing deceased voters. So, Lauren, we're gathered here today to pay our respects to all of the dead Michigan voters. What is that number again?
25,000.
All right, let's go find these voters.
Yeah.
Okay, so who is over here?
We're looking for Pauline Chamanda. So she died November 7th, 1990. She was born in 1908. Yeah. There it is. 1908, November 7th, 1990. Pauline.
So this guy's tombstone is kind of funny. He has poker cards on it.
Next, we have Teresa Demosowitz, and then we have her son, Thomas, and yes, both of them are still registered to vote in Michigan.
I think she's in this plot up here.
Next, we're gonna be seeing Theodore Rudnicki. He died in 1997, and yes, he's also still registered to vote and on Michigan's voter rolls.
Michigan's Auditor General found that 1,616 dead voters cast ballots in Michigan in the 2020 election. Most of them voted early or by mail and died before the election. But in a close race, it could make a difference, which leads us to the next and most important question. For that answer, we had to go to Washington, D.C. Hans.
Sarah, welcome to Washington, D.C.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Hans, we just came here from Michigan, and things aren't going great over in Michigan. What are you seeing nationwide when it comes to voter integrity and security?
We're in better shape today than we were 4 years ago. How good the election is going to depend on which state you're in.
So what are some of the states that got it the most right?
Florida, Georgia, Texas, Tennessee, all passed great improvements to their election laws. So after the 2020 election, what did Georgia do? Well, they extended their voter ID law to absentee ballots, so that you either have to send in a photocopy of your ID, or if you have for example, a state driver's license, you write in the serial number.
What are you seeing with the swing states?
Well, again, it depends. Wisconsin just became, I think, the 28th state to ban zuckbucks. Well, that was $450 million that Mark Zuckerberg and some other liberal donors granted that a small, teeny little nonprofit, who then gave it out in grants all over the country, but almost all the money went to large Democratic urban districts. In Nevada, they now mail out a ballot to every single registered voter. Well, the problem with that is their voter registration list is filled with errors. Well, who's getting that ballot, and what are they going to do with it?
If you look at the mainstream media, you read the mainstream media, they're like, always same talking point, right? There is no widespread evidence of voter fraud. What would you say to that? Is that true or false?
Well, you notice the word they always use, widespread.
Widespread, yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
What, they're not concerned about the kind of election fraud that overturns an election but might not be widespread elsewhere?
Right. Von Spakavsky and the Heritage Foundation keep an election fraud database, which has logged more than 1,500 proven cases of election fraud. In fact, it does happen. As recently as 2016 and 2018, Republican operatives were caught committing mass absentee voter fraud in congressional races in North Carolina. That is something that, until recently, both parties agreed on. In 2005, former President Jimmy Carter co-authored a report with James Baker, the third on how to properly run elections. They found that vote by mail is likely to increase the risks of fraud and of contested elections, in the states especially where the safeguards for ballot integrity are weaker. Their solution was up-to-date voter registration lists, a voter ID system, measures to enhance ballot integrity, a paper trail, and independent electoral institutions. In other words, they recommended exactly the opposite of what most swing states have done. Other countries out there, what are they doing differently than the United States when it comes to elections?
Well, they don't have early voting. You have to show up on election day to vote. Almost all of them don't allow absentee ballots because they have determined that there's too much fraud involved with them. And they uniformly, especially in the EU, they all require an ID if you want to vote.
If mail-in ballot fraud is some sort of right-wing conspiracy, then a lot of European countries are falling for it. A 2020 study published by John Lott at the Crime Prevention Research Center found that the majority of developed nations ban absentee voting unless the citizen is living abroad. Some countries, like Japan and Poland, only provide mail-in ballots to people who verify they're disabled. The few developed countries that allow mail-in ballots either require the citizen to live abroad or require a voter to provide ID. France banned mail-in voting in 1975 after it discovered mass fraud. In 2006, the UK recalled 6 councillors because of a widespread fraud campaign targeting mail-in ballots. Even Brazil, which managed to release election results just hours after its close presidential election in 2022, banned mail-in voting. And yet still, increasing our reliance on unsecured mail-in ballots seems to be a top priority for Democrats. In 2020, during the negotiations over the 4th coronavirus aid package, Democrats demanded universal mail-in ballots for the entire country. So when we're talking about Secretary of State Benson or all of these politicians, are they rigging the game so that they can win?
Well, I think some folks are, and in particular, if you look at the advocacy groups who are suing to prevent election reforms, like when Georgia passed its most recent reforms, all their lawsuits seem to be intended to make voting as insecure as possible. And why would you do that unless you want to game the system?
So we've identified tons of issues across the country when it comes to election integrity. And the question is, if the state legislatures won't actually do anything about it, what can we do? We found the perfect person to talk to about that. Hey, Jay Christian. Hi, Sarah. Very nice to meet you.
Come on in.
Thank you.
This is like my shrine to hopeless causes. That's a picture from the Blitz in London where a guy's delivering milk over rubble. Sometimes what it feels like when you're in this space in election litigation is you have to deliver milk over rubble and get the job done. Well, I worked at the Department of Justice in the voting section for a long time, did cases all over the country.
Jay Christian Adams runs the Public Interest Legal Foundation, where he's suing multiple states over their election rules, including the state of Michigan.
We have cases all over the country, 36, I think, in the last year or two, suing states to clean voter rolls, follow the law, do what they're supposed to do, whether it's in Alaska or Louisiana or Maine, states in between. Michigan has its problems, and they have a Secretary of State who is ideological, has a pedigree in the far left, is very intelligent and very militant and doesn't want to do anything about the problem and fights tooth and nail to keep the corrupted status quo. You need to understand something. Secretary of State Benson actually believes she's doing the right thing. That's how dangerous it is the people who oppose election integrity think they're on the right side. And that's what makes it even more dangerous, because she says things like the lawsuit against her to get the voter rolls clean was an anti-democratic effort, words to that effect. She believes that she's on the right and everybody who cares about election integrity is in the wrong.
How could she possibly believe that?
You have to understand the left. And they spent the formative years of their life swallowing the dogma and growing up and going to law school and starting their careers on the notion that the right, the conservatives, the constitutionalists are a threat to what they value.
So it seems to me like Democrats are intentionally sort of targeting these positions of power that nobody really thought about previously.
Well, it's even worse than that. They have an entirely well-funded infrastructure, C3s, charities, to not only have secretaries of state be leftists, but to fill their offices with leftists.
Democrat officials never believed they could win this election honestly. I really believe that. That's why they did.
As Donald Trump and his associates made claims about rigged voting machines and foreign governments, his adversaries started transforming election systems in broad daylight.
I'll tell you something that won't be very tasty for the viewers.
Yeah.
Is our side, it's almost like we have been infected with craziness in this space that is being used to undermine our abilities to actually make things better.
100%.
You see what I mean?
Yep.
I deal with it regularly where these myths and fables about what's going on are being pushed, and sometimes I'm like, gosh, that almost seems like a Soros plan. Like, you know, like if I was George Soros, I would put all kinds of wackos in the election integrity movement.
Talking about this is, I gotta tell you, a little bit depressing. So I wanna ask you this. If someone who's watching right now, they live in, you know, a state where we've got these Soros-funded secretaries of state, what can they do about it?
The first thing they need to do is vote. Don't be discouraged. But for heaven's sakes, get your vote in, because it'll make a difference.
Have no doubt, opponents of clean elections will call this report a threat to democracy. They'll say we're denying elections and undermining faith in the system. It's all projection. They're accusing us of exactly what they've done. No other first world countries use a system like ours. As Americans, we have every right to call them out on it. They'll use their proxies in the media to hit back. They'll copy and paste the same line, "There's no evidence of widespread voter fraud." Perhaps in the future, they could add that the current system is designed so it's impossible to actually know if there's widespread voter fraud. This is all we want. After all the chaos of 2020, our leaders should do what they can to restore people's faith in our election system. Regardless of who wins this year, the worst outcome would be contested ballots, more fraud claims, and late-night ballot dumps. Yet, at this point, it seems almost inevitable. Our country and its institutions will be further degraded because of it. It doesn't have to be this way.